I wanted the bottom one because it contained all of the sodium phthalate. So I drained it all out into a beaker, and I continued on with that mission. Left behind, though, was a bunch of yellow liquid, which was mostly rubbing alcohol. However, it also contained all of the isononanol tails, and this was where my hot sauce adventure began. Or, where it technically began, because I didn't actually end up touching any of this for over a year. This is mostly because it took me that long to get the courage to attempt this project. One day, though, I randomly decided that I was ready to commit to it, and I just got started. The first thing that I had to do was find all of that yellow juice that I'd made, which was actually 5 jars, and not just one. This was because I ended up needing a lot more sodium phthalate for the grape flavor, and I had to repeat the same extraction 4 more times, on a total of 100 gloves. But either way, all this meant was that I now had a bunch more of it, and what I had to do next was pull out all of the isononanol that was in here. Then, once I had it isolated, I could start building it into my spicy molecule called nor-dihydrocapsaicin. But with that being said, to get the isononanol, it was relatively simple, and I was just gonna have to distill it. So, to get started, I poured everything into a large flask. After that, I dropped in a stir bar, and above the flask, I added a short path condenser and a thermometer. I then attached some water lines to cool the condenser, and I also added a heating mantle. The beaker was there to collect everything that distilled over, and when I felt that I was ready, I turned on the heating. It wasn't too long before hot vapor started climbing out of the flask, and it eventually made it to the condenser. This was turning it from a vapor back into a liquid, and it started dripping into the beaker. What I was collecting here was the isopropyl rubbing alcohol that I had originally used to extract the DINP. The goal here was to distill over all of it, and left behind should have been just the isononanol. So, I was just gonna have to wait for it all to make it over, and unfortunately, it was gonna take a while. It ended up taking even longer than I expected, and it took 4 hours to collect about 800 mils. I then swapped it out for a new beaker, and I continued waiting. It was only after another 2 hours that it was finally looking like it was close to being done. However, I then saw something that I didn't like. The liquid that was coming over had become cloudy, and this meant that there was water in it. And this was a problem, because there was still way too much liquid in the flask. This told me that most of it was just water, and I had to stop the distillation. I then had to wait for it to cool down, and when it was only slightly warm, I poured it all into a separatory funnel. The stuff that I had now looked a lot thicker and goopier than before, and by the time I was done adding it, I could already see some water separating out. I then let it sit there for about half an hour, and I waited for it to fully separate. When it eventually looked like it was done, I opened the valve, and I drained it all out. Left in the funnel should have been mostly isononanol, and I poured all of it back into a flask. It was all still really dirty and orange though, and I was gonna have to clean it up. To do this, I'd have to do another distillation, and I put together almost the exact same setup as before. I then waited, and over the next 15 minutes, it eventually started boiling. Then not too long after this, something started coming over, and it was just water. The temperature then slowly started rising, and I started collecting some other weird oily junk. Eventually, though, the temperature stopped rising when it got to 205°C, and this was the boiling point of isononanol. The fact that it stopped here was a nice confirmation that I did in fact have isononanol, and I swapped out the beaker. What was coming over now looked really nice and clean, and I kept collecting it until it got to 208C. At this point, the distillation was done, and I now had a bunch of fresh isononanol. In total, it was about 97 grams, and it was almost exactly how much I was hoping to get. It was also way more than I needed, which was nice, because it meant that I could screw up a lot and still be okay. But anyway, with that being said, I could finally start trying to build my spicy molecule, and the first step was to convert this isononanol into isononanoic acid. I wasn't exactly sure how to do this, but the first idea that I came up with was to use something called potassium permanganate. This was because I had already used it a few years ago to do a very similar reaction. I turned butanol into butanoic acid, which smells like vomit, and I figured I could just almost do the same thing. However, long story short, it didn't work at all. I tried many times, but it was always a complete and utter failure. So I was going to have to come up with another way, and I started thinking that something called Jones reagent might work. It was also pretty much the only other option that I had, and I decided to try it out. To get started, the first step was to make the Jones reagent, and I added 22 mils of water to a beaker. I then added 15.4 grams of chromium trioxide, and I stirred it until it all dissolved. When it was all gone, I moved it to an ice bath, and I waited for it to get nice and cold. When it eventually got to around 5C, I started adding concentrated sulfuric acid. Every time it was added, though, it generated a lot of heat, and I had to do it in small portions. I also had to keep the temperature below 10C, and it took about an hour to add everything. When it was finally done, I poured in some ice-cold water, and at this point, the Jones reagent was ready. I didn't need it right at this moment, though, so I just let it chill here for a bit. I then went and got another beaker, and into this, I added 350 mils of acetone. This was going to be the solvent for the reaction, and for now, the only other thing that I had to add was 5 grams of my fresh isononanol. I then turned on the stirring, and when it had all dissolved, I moved it to an ice bath, and I added a thermometer. I was also going to have to wait for this to cool down, and I left it here for about half an hour. When I came back to it, the temperature was around 5C, and what I had to do next was start adding the Jones reagent. After it was added, it slowly changed color, and this was because the chromium in the Jones reagent was getting reduced. This was a very good sign that it was reacting with the isononanol, and hopefully, it was turning it into the isononanoic acid. The goal here was to eventually add all of the Jones reagent, but I had to do it really slowly. This was because every time that I added it, the temperature would increase, and to prevent side products, I had to keep it below 5C. So I just kept adding it slowly and carefully, and at some point it stopped changing colors and kind of just stayed a brownish orange. This was happening because the Jones reagent was starting to build up, and this told me that most of the isononanol had probably reacted. In total, it took about 3 hours to add everything, and now I had to just let it stir for a while. About 2 hours later, it looked almost the same, and at this point, it should have been done. What I had to do next was destroy all of that extra Jones reagent, and this was thankfully pretty simple. All I had to do was add some isopropyl rubbing alcohol. This would quickly react with it and turn into acetone, which was the same as the reaction solvent. At first, I was adding it only a bit at a time because I didn't want to add too much. I eventually kind of gave up though, and I just dumped in a whole bunch. This quickly caused the color to change to a really nice blue. I then let it stir like this for about 30 minutes to really make sure that all of the Jones reagent was destroyed. When I came back to it, it looked pretty much the same, and the next thing I had to do was filter it. To do this, I poured it into a funnel with cotton and sea light, and I waited for it to slowly pass through. This actually ended up going somewhat quickly, and I was eventually left with a nice and clear solution. Left in the funnel was a bunch of dark blue chromium salts, and this was all waste. But anyway, what I had to do next was get rid of most of the acetone. So I put it on a hot plate, dropped in a stir bar, and cranked up the heating. I also set up a fan to blow on it to make it go faster, but it still took about 6 hours for most of it to disappear. When I eventually felt like I'd gotten rid of enough, I poured it all into a separatory funnel. On top of this, I added a bunch of distilled water to dilute it. Then I added a solvent called dichloromethane, or DCM for short. It wasn't able to mix with the water though, and it quickly sank to the bottom as a separate layer. With everything added, I took it off the stand, and I started shaking it around. I was doing this to really mix things up, and when I felt that it was enough, I put it back on the stand. As it sat there, the layers separated again, and all the DCM sank to the bottom. Now, assuming that I actually made any isononanoic acid, it should have been dissolved in the DCM. So, I drained it all out into a beaker. Everything that was left in the funnel should have been mostly water and sulfuric acid. There still might have been some isononanoic acid though, so I added some more DCM to it, and I extracted it a few more times. After every extraction, I drained the dichloromethane into the same beaker, and I eventually had a bunch of cloudy liquid. It was all cloudy because it was full of water, and before moving on, I was gonna have to dry it. So, I poured it into another separatory funnel. I then added some saturated salt water, which would pull out most of the water. I then shook it around, and when the layers eventually separated, it was looking pretty good. The only tricky part here was that the DCM was no longer the lower layer, and it was now the upper one. The bottom one was the salt water that I had added, and I drained it all away. I then poured everything into a beaker, and unfortunately, it was still a bit cloudy. So I turned on the stirring, and I added some anhydrous sodium sulfate to dry it even more. I let this stir for a while, and when I felt that it was done, I poured it all into another flask. The next step was to get rid of all the DCM, and I had to do another distillation. This went relatively quickly, and after a while, all that was left was a thick oil. This was all hopefully isononanoic acid, but I don't think it was very pure, and I was gonna have to clean it up. So I stopped the distillation, and when everything had cooled down, I transferred all of it to a much smaller flask. I then attempted to distill it, but for some reason, it absolutely refused to work. Instead, it just bubbled and frothed, and after several hours of trying, it was still a complete failure. It was at this point that I really started worrying that I might have been stuck. I still had no idea how much of this was actually isononanoic acid, and it was going to be a big problem if I couldn't purify it. There was still hope, though, because there was one other thing that I thought might work. So I got out a beaker, and I added 50 mils of distilled water. Then into this, I shot in all of my goopy liquid. It all just quickly floated to the top, and I turned on the stirring. As an oil, it didn't at all mix with the water, but then I started adding a solution of sodium hydroxide drain cleaner. This was a very strong base, and if I did actually have isononanoic acid, it should react, and turn into a water-soluble form. As I kept adding it, the oil slowly disappeared, and I was really happy to see this. This didn't fully confirm that this was isononanoic acid, but it was pretty good evidence. Even after adding a lot of base, though, it was still a bit cloudy, so I added a bunch more. However, this didn't really seem to do anything, and this was because there was some sort of impurity. I was going to have to get rid of it, and to do this, I was going to have to put it back into a separatory funnel. I then added a different solvent called hexanes, which would dissolve most of the impurities. After shaking it around, I drained out the lower layer, and I threw away the hexanes. I then put the lower layer back into the funnel, and I washed it a couple more times with hexanes. This would hopefully get rid of most of the side products, and any other junk that might be in there. When I was eventually done with that, it was time for the moment of truth. I had to add some dilute acid, and this would immediately tell me if everything had worked. I was pretty sure that it had, but I was also completely prepared to be disappointed. So I just dumped it all in, and it almost immediately turned everything white, which I was extremely happy to see. This was all isononanoic acid being regenerated, and it was going back to being insoluble in water. I then again added some hexanes, but this time, it would actually dissolve the isononanoic acid. I then shook it around, and I waited for the layers to separate. However, now, it was the hexanes part that I wanted. So, I drained away the lower one, and I dumped all the hexanes into a beaker. I then did the same extraction a few more times, and I combined everything. When I was done, I added some sodium sulfate to dry it, and I stirred it for several minutes. Now, all I had to do was get rid of the hexanes. So, I poured it all into a flask, and I did what felt like the billionth distillation. This thankfully didn't take very long, though, and about an hour later, it looked like all the hexanes were gone. I then let it cool down, and I transferred it all to a small vial. My final yield here was 3.5 grams of nearly pure isononanoic acid, and this was pretty much the perfect amount. Okay, so now, after a week or so of pain, I had the first major piece of my spicy molecule. This was only half of it though, and getting this was also kind of the easy part. The hard part was going to be actually building it into the spicy molecule that I wanted, called nor-dihydrocapsaicin. This was mostly because I started this project without even knowing how I was going to do it. I mean, I had a few basic ideas, but nothing really concrete. By the time that I got to this point, though, I realized that there was only one decent way. I was going to have to build the entire other half separately, and then add it onto the isononanoic acid. Normally, this wouldn't be too bad, but in this case, not only was I unsure how to make it, I was kind of unsure how to add it. The only thing that I knew was that the chemical that I needed looked oddly similar to something called vanillin, which is the major flavor component of vanilla. So now, I had to update the plan for the project. I was going to have to get my hands on some vanillin and turn it into something called vanillylamine. I could then add this to my isononanoic acid to make the beautiful and spicy nor-dihydrocapsaicin. So I guess now I would be technically turning plastic gloves and vanilla into hot sauce, which I honestly think is even weirder. I mean, it all makes sense on paper, but I still find it really hard to believe that these two completely unrelated things can be combined to make spiciness. But anyway, to get started, the first thing that I had to do was get some vanillin. From past experience, I found that the best and easiest source was vanilla sugar, and I found a bunch of it at a grocery store. I wasn't exactly sure how many to get, but I figured that 18 was a decent amount. I then started cutting them all open and dumping them into a beaker. In total, This was going to give me a bit over 300 grams of vanilla sugar, and it only took a few minutes to empty everything. When all of them were eventually added, I started pouring in some methanol, and I added just enough to cover it. In total, this ended up being about 300 mils, and then I started mixing it. What I was trying to do here was selectively dissolve the vanillin, which was kind of just mixed into a bunch of sugar. The sugar itself was practically insoluble in methanol, and pretty much all of it should be left behind. But anyway, I then let it sit there for about 30 minutes to really make sure that I dissolved as much vanillin as possible. When I came back, it looked pretty much the same, and what I had to do next was separate the methanol. To do this, I was going to have to filter it, and I scooped it all into my vacuum filter. When it was all eventually added, I washed the beaker with some extra methanol, and I mixed it around a bit. I then turned on my vacuum pump, and I pulled all the methanol into a flask below the filter. To really make sure that I got out all the vanillin, I washed the sugar a couple more times with methanol, and that was basically it. The only issue was that some of the sugar had made it through, and it was a bit cloudy. This was relatively easy to fix though, and I just filtered it again through some cotton and sea light. It was kind of slow, but what came through was a lot better, and it was almost crystal clear. What I had now was a relatively clean looking solution, and what I had to do next was get rid of all the methanol. In theory, assuming it's actually in there, this should leave me with relatively pure vanillin. So I turned on the stirring and the heating, and I waited for it to warm up. Over the next 2 hours, the methanol slowly disappeared, and when there was only about 200 mils left, I transferred it to a smaller beaker. I then just waited again, and when it eventually got down to about 25 mils, I transferred it to an even smaller beaker. At this point, there really wasn't very much methanol left, and when it eventually got to around 10 mils, it looked like it stopped decreasing. So I pulled it off the hot plate, and I waited for it to cool down. As it was cooling, I was really hoping that it would solidify, but it apparently stayed as a liquid, and it looked like it separated into layers. This was a bit odd, but to fix it, I decided to try stirring it around and scraping the sides of the beaker. This can sometimes get things to crystallize, and at first, it really didn't look like it was working. However, I started seeing some little white bits, and then a whole bunch of solid stuff started appearing. This was all vanillin, and it looked like there was a decent amount. I kept stirring it for a couple minutes, but it still didn't look like everything had precipitated. There was probably still some methanol there, keeping it dissolved, so I added some water to force it out. This actually seemed to work pretty well, so just for good measure, I added a few more mils, and that was about it. What I had now was a bunch of wet vanillin, but I wanted a nice powder, so I transferred it all to a vacuum filter. When everything was in there, I turned on my vacuum pump, and I pulled away the water. I then mixed it around a bit, and I was starting to see the powder that I